For over a century, the galaxy had moved on without a single mention of humanity. The great warlords, empires, and colonists who once battled across star systems had all but forgotten them. Earth had burned itself to ash in a storm of pride and rage, and the colonies that had once flourished in the outer reaches fell silent one by one. A million whispers had died on the wind, as if the human race had simply ceased to exist. The Empire, with all its might and endless reach, had decided humanity was no more. Extinct, erased from history, a forgotten chapter in the great ledger of time. But something strange began to happen. It started as a flicker, a blip, unnoticed at first, just another anomaly in the vast nothingness of space. For weeks, their finest scanners picked up nothing of interest in the normally secure viral prime sector. Life continued, but then the air seemed to change. The sensors began to tremble. It was as if something invisible tore a hole in reality itself. Without warning, it appeared. A shadow, a hulking shape that didn't belong, hovering silently in the vastness of space. The Imperial fleet was caught completely off guard, with no warning, no signal, no trace of entry, no wormhole, no hyperspace flash, no stellar phenomenon to explain its sudden arrival. It simply materialized. The warship was vast, its dark hull pockmarked and scarred by the marks of battle, its surface reflecting no light, absorbing it like a predator waiting in the shadows. This ship, however, wasn't just a relic of a forgotten age. Its size dwarfed even the greatest of Imperial dreadbreakers. It seemed ancient, but its presence was anything but passive. The Imperial fleet scrambled to respond. Sensors failed to register its true mass, as if the warship itself was somehow outside their perception. It didn't emit any detectable heat. It moved not like a ship, but like an animal, sleek and predatory, swimming through the vacuum of space with a purpose the Empire couldn't fathom. And then it struck. Without a single warning, a pulse of light erupted from its belly, a wave so fast it was gone before their instruments even registered it. 4 Imperial cruisers vanished in an instant, no explosion, no wreckage, just a silent, seamless disappearance. The fleet had never seen anything like it, a weapon beyond comprehension, beyond anything in their most secret archives. Panic spread like wildfire. The entire command structure of the Empire began to break apart as orders were shouted, alarms blared, and ships scrambled to adjust. But none of it mattered. The warship just hovered still and silent, its presence a shadow over the entire sector. The Emperor himself stood at the spire of his palace, staring out at the ominous sight. His 3 hearts beat in a frantic rhythm, his scales darkening with fury. His second set of eyelids blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. "What in the void is that?" he muttered, voice shaking with disbelief as his advisors scrambled to make sense of the situation. High Marshal Torrin stepped forward, his face pale, voice shaky. "We believe it's a human vessel, Your Eminence." Crix, the Emperor, turned slowly, eyes narrowing in disbelief. "That's impossible. Humanity is extinct. They were never supposed to return." Torrin hesitated, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Respectfully, sir, I think that's no longer accurate." Before anyone could speak further, the warship moved. It wasn't slow, wasn't deliberate. It shifted in an instant, like a predator lunging at its prey. The Empire's fleet hesitated. No one knew whether to attack, to run, or to wait. And that hesitation cost them dearly. Another pulse erupted, this time a blur of energy faster than light. The fleet's finest ships were gone, vanished without a trace. Nothing but the void and the warship, silent, watching. Chaos erupted in the halls of the Imperial Citadel. Communications lines buzzed with frenzied messages. Citizens panicked. The planetary defense grid hummed to life, but it was already too late. The warship was beyond their reach, and it seemed to know it. It wasn't attacking, it was simply observing. Torin's voice cracked as he turned to the Emperor. "We need to open a channel. Maybe it's a rogue AI. Maybe it can be reasoned with." Emperor Crix hissed, his sharp teeth flashing. "You want to talk to it? After what it just did?" "We don't have a choice," Torin replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The Empire's finest diplomats, linguists, and signal experts scrambled to make contact. They broadcasted in every known language. They pleaded, they threatened, they demanded, but the ship didn't respond. It simply waited, and then, just when they thought the silence would swallow them whole, a transmission came through, but it wasn't a voice. It wasn't a message. It was an image, burned onto every screen across the Empire. A human face, old, cold, eyes filled with the weight of wars long past, and beneath it, in simple, unflinching text, were 4 words. "We never left." The message faded, but its effect didn't. The transmission flickered on every screen, its 4 words carved into the hearts of every Imperial citizen. "We never left." The faces of the Emperor's closest advisors, once calm and composed, now reflected the kind of fear that had not been seen in the Empire for centuries. These were people who had watched their fleets crush planets, who had orchestrated the fall of entire civilizations, and yet here they stood, powerless. A small group of them, veterans of wars and political maneuvers, huddled around a flickering comm device, faces pale as ghosts. "What do we do now, Your Eminence?" whispered General Mirren, her voice betraying the crack in her usually unshakable composure. She had served the Empire for decades, her cybernetic enhancements a reminder of the brutal wars fought in the galaxy's forgotten corners. Her reputation was that of a woman who never flinched under pressure, but the image of that human face, weathered, scarred, and yet somehow knowing, had shattered her confidence. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his golden eyes narrowing, calculating. He was a creature built for war, for dominance, for fear. His species had ruled over the galaxy with an iron grip for millennia, and nothing had ever shaken that power, until now. "We never left." The words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, growing louder, more impossible with each passing second. "Prepare the fleet," Crix said at last, his voice thick with venom. "Get me every fleet captain, deploy the Inquisitors, find out who is responsible for this ghost." Mirren nodded curtly, but the doubt in her eyes was unmistakable. A ghost. That was what Crix called it. But she knew something else. The human race had been wiped from the records of the Empire, wiped from history itself. That face, though, it was not a ghost. It was a reminder, a challenge. The universe had assumed humanity was extinct, but it was not. And that, to Mirren, was the most terrifying thing of all. As Crix ordered the fleet into position, the Imperial Command Center fell into a tense silence. Every officer, every soldier, every strategist was now haunted by the same question. What did humanity want? After a century of silence, after being forgotten and written off as a failed species, why had they come back now? Meanwhile, across the capital on Veryl Prime, in the heart of the Empire's vast network of surveillance and control, an uneasy panic had begun to spread through the populace. It started in the lower districts, whispers spreading from the poorest to the richest. The rumors flowed like wildfire. Humans were back. For years, the Empire had fed its citizens with tales of how humanity had self-destructed, how they had torn themselves apart in endless wars, their colonies falling into ruin. The destruction of Earth had been considered the final nail in humanity's coffin, and the Empire had celebrated their victory. unaware that their own legacy of oppression and conquest was far from secure. In the streets of Varel Prime, news outlets and media networks erupted with debates, confusion, and outright hysteria. Citizens were glued to their holoscreens as the message was broadcast across every channel. No matter how the Empire tried to spin it, the reality was inescapable. Humanity had returned, not as a conquered species, not as a relic of the past, but as something else entirely. On the palace spire, Crix paced angrily, his claws clicking against the floor, his breathing growing shallow. 1,000 years of rule built on the ashes of the species that had once been humiliated by the Empire was now under threat, and he could feel it. Deep down, he knew that no fleet, no military might, no amount of firepower could ever erase the seed of fear that had just been planted. Something more dangerous than any weapon had been unleashed upon the galaxy: the truth. General Mirren stood beside Crix, watching him pace. Her thoughts raced faster than her heart could follow. She had spent years studying the history of humanity, learning every tactical move, every battle strategy, but all of that had been theory. Now she was confronted with a reality she had not prepared for. She looked up at the Emperor, who had gone silent once more. His eyes were hard, but there was something else there, something she hadn't seen before: doubt. Even a creature like him could feel the weight of history pressing against him. He had always relied on fear to control the galaxy, but now fear was no longer his weapon. It was his weakness. "They've been watching us," Mirren said quietly, almost to herself. Crix froze, his eyes flickering toward her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that this ship, this warship, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's been waiting, perhaps, for decades, hidden far beyond the Empire's reach." Her voice lowered. "And now it has come to remind us of something we forgot." Crix hissed through his teeth, the sound sharp and venomous. "Enough. We deal with it the way we've always dealt with threats." But Mirren wasn't convinced. The warship wasn't just a threat. It was a message, and the message was simple: we never left. It was the kind of message that cut through any empire, any fortress, any defenses. It made the impossible seem real, and now every citizen of the Empire was waiting for something they couldn't fully understand. Elsewhere in the galaxy, panic was already starting to take hold. Planetary governors began to make secret moves, pulling their forces back from the Imperial fleet. Discontent simmered in the Outer Rim colonies, where whispers of rebellion stirred like distant storms. The Empire's power had always been built on the submission of the many, but now those who had once bowed before them were beginning to question that obedience. A secret transmission had made its way through the undercurrents of Imperial communication, one that hadn't been broadcast but instead had been carefully passed between the few who dared to question the regime. It was a voice, low, measured, filled with ancient wisdom. "You forgot us," the voice had said, the words simple but laden with centuries of grief. "That was your first mistake." The voice belonged to someone who had been there, who had seen the birth and fall of empires, someone who knew how to use fear against its masters. And as that voice spoke, it reminded every citizen of the Empire of something they had been taught to forget. "We watched you. We remembered. We survived." The whisper of revolution began to stir in the streets. Former Imperial officers turned their backs on their posts. The fleet, once unshakable, began to crack as commanders questioned their loyalties. Those who had once declared themselves the Empire's finest, who had believed in the invincibility of their cause, now found themselves looking over their shoulders. And somewhere, hidden away in the darkest corners of the Empire's most secure networks, the truth was finally coming to light. The human resistance had never been defeated. They had simply bided their time. And now they had returned not to beg for mercy, not to fall at the feet of the Empire's might, but to remind the galaxy of one thing: we never left. In the silence that followed, the people of the Empire began to wonder, had the war really been won, or had they simply been lulled into complacency, forgetting that the price of conquest always comes with a debt? The fleet was mobilizing now as Crix had ordered, but the questions lingered, unanswered and growing. As the Imperial fleet rumbled into motion, a cold wave of dread settled over Viral Prime. The warships, once the epitome of the Empire's dominance, now felt like nothing more than toys in the hands of something much older, much more dangerous. Admiral Velis, one of the most seasoned commanders in the Imperial Navy, stood in the command center of his flagship, staring at the vast stretch of stars beyond the viewport. The message that had been broadcasted across the galaxy had sent ripples of unease through even the most battle-hardened officers. The voice, the image, it had left an impression on everyone. Humanity hadn't just returned. They had been watching, observing, waiting. And now, as Velis' eyes scanned the communication screens, flashing with reports of fleet movements, planetary defenses coming online, and increasing unrest from the outer colonies, he realized the truth. The Empire was no longer the unquestioned master of the galaxy. It had been complacent, arrogant in its assumption that no one could challenge its supremacy. And now, for the first time in generations, the mighty Empire was shaking. "They are testing us," Admiral Velis muttered under his breath. His voice was rough, his tone filled with a new understanding of the perilous situation they were facing. He looked over at his chief tactical officer, who was pacing nervously, his fingers twitching on the control panel. "We don't know what they're capable of, sir," the officer said, his voice cracking with tension. "The ship's weapons, they disintegrated 4 of our finest cruisers in an instant. No warning, no visible force, just gone, like they never existed." Velis narrowed his eyes. "And now we're supposed to throw our entire fleet at them. What good would that do?" He stood from his seat and approached the officer. "Our most powerful weapons couldn't even scratch that warship. Whatever it is, it's beyond anything we've seen, beyond anything we've ever been able to understand." The officer's gaze dropped to the floor. "Then, what do we do, sir?" Velis turned back to the viewport, his thoughts racing. The warships were already in position, but their approach was slow. Careful, they were still unsure of the true capabilities of the enemy, uncertain of how to engage with a force that didn't respond to their conventional tactics. He was a seasoned veteran, but the raw fear that had settled into his chest was something he had never felt before. Not even during the most brutal conflicts of his career. The Empire had faced many enemies over the centuries, but none like this. None who seemed to appear from thin air with no visible means of travel and with a weapon capable of erasing entire fleets. And yet Velis knew they couldn't retreat. They couldn't show fear. The Empire's reputation, its very existence, depended on the show of force. The image of the human face that had appeared on every screen across the galaxy, stern, cold, resolute, reminded him of something the Empire had long since forgotten, the fear that kept them in power, the fear that now rippled through the ranks of his fleet. He squared his shoulders and turned to his officers. "We proceed as planned. We make them understand. They may be watching, but they'll learn the price of challenging the Empire." Behind him, the tactical officer hesitated, but eventually nodded. The fleet had its orders, and for better or worse, they would follow them. The enemy, this ghost ship, had declared itself. Now it was time for the Empire to respond in kind. Meanwhile, far from the Imperial fleet's ever-watchful eyes, a group of rebels long thought to be remnants of a forgotten war were preparing for something far more significant than any battle. The human warship had been a message, yes, but it was only the beginning. Humanity's return was not about reclaiming lost glory, nor was it a mere act of vengeance. It was something deeper, something more profound. General Mirren, the young officer who had once stood by the Emperor's side, had begun to understand the full extent of what was unfolding. The warship, the face on the screen, the chilling words, they had been the catalyst, the beginning of something much larger. The human race had not come back to wage war. They had come back to show the Empire what true power was. They had come back to remind the galaxy who had once ruled it. But what truly shook Mirren was the growing realization that she wasn't just an observer in this conflict, she was a part of it. In the secrecy of her private quarters, she had been delving into her past, uncovering the fragments of a history that had been stolen from her. Her once clear allegiance to the Empire had started to blur. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the Empire she had served, the Empire she had helped to build, was nothing more than a collection of lies. As she sat alone in her quarters, the truth was becoming undeniable. She was one of them. She was human. The identity her handlers had given her, the name she had been raised with, the role she had played as an elite officer in the Imperial military, it was all a fabrication. She was a product of the Empire's darkest secrets, a child taken from the ashes of humanity's final struggle, reprogrammed and remade into a weapon for a regime that had never understood the cost of its power. A strange voice echoed in her mind, the voice she had heard only moments ago, the voice that had shown her the truth of her origins. You are not theirs. You never were. Mirren's breath caught as the words rang through her head. She wasn't sure where the voice had come from, whether it was a memory or some sort of latent programming waking inside her, but she knew one thing: it was the truth. She had never truly belonged to the Empire. She had always been a part of something greater, a resistance she had been born into, one that had been waiting for her to remember. The warship had come not to destroy the Empire, but to reclaim what had been lost. And she was a part of that reclamation. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. She stood abruptly, her body trembling with the weight of what she had uncovered. The Empire had used her. They had stolen her past, erased her history, and twisted her into an instrument of their will. But now the truth was undeniable. The warship that hovered silently above the capital had come for her, just as much as it had come for the Empire. And so, as the Empire's fleet continued its slow march toward the unknown, Mirren knew that her time had come. The question wasn't whether she would stand against the Empire. She already had. The question was whether she would finally stand for herself. With a deep breath, Mirren moved to the comm panel and activated it. She needed answers. She needed to speak to someone who had the same answers she was just beginning to grasp. And somewhere far away in the depths of space, the ship that had declared humanity's return was waiting, watching. For all the power of the Empire, there was one thing they could never defeat: the truth. Mirren's hand hovered over the comm panel, her mind a swirling tempest of thoughts. She had always believed in the Empire's cause, its mission to bring order to the galaxy. It had been ingrained in her from the time she was a child. She had been a weapon, a shield for the Empire's power. But now the reality of her origins, of the truth buried deep within her, was gnawing at her like a hunger she couldn't ignore. The voice, the one that had whispered to her in the silence of her quarters, echoed in her mind again. You are not theirs. You never were. It was a message, clear, undeniable, and yet full of questions. Who was she really? What had been done to her? And why had she, of all people, been chosen to be part of the Empire's facade, a piece of a machine that had crushed the very species she was born from? She closed her eyes, blocking out the noise of the palace around her. The palace, the heart of the Empire, was now a hollow place to her. The once majestic walls, the ornate decorations, the gleaming halls, all of it felt empty now. The Empire had built its power on lies, and now that it was beginning to crumble, she realized she had been nothing more than a tool in its grand game. The Emperor, the military, all of it, they had used her to maintain their reign, their belief that the galaxy had no choice but to kneel before them. But humanity had never truly died. They had only been waiting, and now they had come back. Mirren pressed the button. The comlink buzzed, sending a chill down her spine as the screen flickered to life. On the other end, the face that appeared was familiar, but not. It was the face of someone who had once been lost to history, someone who had vanished without a trace, someone who was more than a ghost. It was Kyle Voss. His expression was calm, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something fierce and knowing, like he had seen the end of 1,000 worlds and was now watching the beginning of another. "General Mirren," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "I trust you've been thinking." She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I've been thinking, yes, about everything, about who I am, who I was, and who you are, Kyle." Her voice shook, despite herself. "What have you done to me?" Voss studied her with a look that made her feel as though he was seeing through her, as if all the walls she had carefully built around herself had been stripped away. "We didn't do anything to you, Mirren," he said softly. "Not in the way you're thinking. We gave you the truth, just like we gave the rest of your people." Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts a mess of conflicting emotions. She had always believed that humanity had been destroyed. It had been her identity, her purpose. But now the pieces of her past, the pieces of who she truly was, were falling into place, and it felt like the very ground beneath her was crumbling. "I was born to fight for the Empire," she whispered almost to herself. "That's who I am. That's all I've ever been. What else is there?" Voss's face softened. "You were born to be something more, the same as the rest of your people. The Empire stole your past, your family, your identity. They reprogrammed you, turned you into their tool. But you've always been more than that. Deep down, you've always known it." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't allow herself to cry. "How can you say that? How can you say I'm not just one of them? One of the very things I've fought for my entire life?" Voss leaned forward slightly, his expression turning serious. "Because you're a human being, Mirren, not a weapon, not a puppet of the Empire, a person. The humans they tried to erase from history. We're still here. We're still watching. And we've been waiting for you." The words stung her like a slap, but they also made something inside her stir, a small, flickering flame of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. It was a word that had been absent from her vocabulary for too long, buried beneath the weight of endless duty, endless war. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you wait? Why didn't you come for us sooner?" "We've been here all along," Voss replied. "Waiting, planning, watching as the Empire grew complacent, thinking they could control everything, thinking they could make the galaxy forget about us. But you're here now. You're a part of it all, Mirren. You were always meant to be." Mirren's hands shook as she reached for the controls of the comm panel. "And if I can't be part of it, what then?" Voss paused for a long moment, as though considering her question carefully. "Then you'll see the truth for yourself. It won't be easy. The Empire won't let go of its power without a fight. But that's why we're here, to remind them that they can't keep hiding their secrets forever." Mirren stared at the screen, her mind racing. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. She had always believed in the Empire, in the order they provided, in the structure that kept the galaxy from descending into chaos. But what if that order was built on lies, What if everything she had fought for was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to crumble under the slightest touch? She stood abruptly, pacing across the room. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can be what you want me to be. You already are. Voss's voice came through, calm, unshakable. You just have to remember, the warship that's hovering above your capital, it's not there to destroy. It's here to remind everyone that humanity never truly disappeared, and you, Mirren, are the key to everything. She stopped in her tracks. The warship. It had never attacked, never fired another shot after its initial display of power. Instead, it hovered, silent and watching, as if waiting for the Empire to make the first move. It had left its mark on the galaxy already. Fear had spread like wildfire, not because of its firepower, but because of the truth it represented. The Empire had forgotten humanity. They had written them off, erased them from the galactic narrative. But now, with every passing moment, humanity was coming back, not to be feared, but to be understood. And the Empire, for the first time in its history, was on the verge of collapse. Mirren turned back toward the comm panel, determination filling her chest. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice steady now. Voss smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. We want you to speak the truth, Mirren. Not in the shadows, not behind closed doors. We want you to stand before the Empire and tell them who you really are. Tell them what they've done. Let them hear your voice, the voice of a people they thought were gone. Mirren closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. Tell them the truth. She had always been a soldier, a protector of the Empire, but the war was no longer the one fought in distant star systems. It was a war for identity, for justice, and for the freedom to live without fear of an oppressive, deceitful regime. And as the warship continued to hover above, waiting, watching, the moment for truth was finally coming. The Empire had no idea what was coming for them. Mirren stood there for a long moment, the weight of Voss's words settling deep within her. Her mind churned, wrestling with the enormity of what she had just learned, of who she had become. A part of her wanted to run, to hide from the truth, to retreat back into the comforting shell of duty that the Empire had built for her. But another part, the part that had been buried deep inside her for so long, demanded to be heard. The truth demanded to be spoken. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, her eyes meeting her own, but this time she didn't see the hardened general. She didn't see the cold, calculating officer who had spent her life following orders without question. What she saw now was something else. She saw the girl who had once dreamed of a future not defined by war, a future not dictated by the Empire's twisted ideology. She saw someone who had been taken from her family, someone whose past had been stolen, but who had the power to reclaim it. She was no longer their tool. She was no longer their weapon. She was human. Her decision was made. The Empire's lies had already cost too many lives. They had built their power on the ruins of the very people they had erased. It was time for the galaxy to know the truth no matter what it cost her. With newfound resolve, Mirren walked to the control panel, her fingers steady as she activated the comm link once more. The image of Kyle Voss reappeared on the screen, waiting for her, his expression calm but expectant. "It's done," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll speak the truth, but not just to the Empire, to the galaxy. I'll go to the Senate, I'll go to the Imperial Court. I'll make them listen." Voss nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "We'll be with you, Mirren, every step of the way. It's time for the galaxy to see the face of the Empire they've never known." Mirren turned away from the comm screen, her heart pounding with anticipation. The truth would no longer be a whisper in the shadows. It would be a roar shaking the foundations of everything the Empire had built. She had been their weapon, but now She would be the voice that brought it all down. Hours later, in the heart of the Imperial Citadel, the Senate was in chaos. The once proud institution that had served as the final bastion of the Empire's authority was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Senators screamed, generals argued, and advisors whispered of coups and rebellions. The warships of the human fleet loomed ominously outside the capital, waiting, watching. The Empire, for the first time in its history, was unsure of its next move. Inside the Senate chamber, Emperor Crix stood at the center, his golden armor gleaming beneath the lights. His eyes were narrow, his claws flexing in anger as he surveyed the scene. The face of humanity, the one they had tried so hard to bury, was now staring back at him. It was no longer a relic of the past. It was real, and it was here to reclaim its place in the galaxy. The doors to the chamber opened, and all eyes turned as General Mirren, now Commander Era Thorn, entered. She walked alone, her black officer's uniform a sharp contrast to the glittering regalia of the Imperial Court. She was not accompanied by guards. She didn't need them. The chamber fell silent as she moved to the center of the room, her eyes fixed firmly on the Emperor. Crix sneered at her, his eyes filled with contempt. "You return now, after all this time, to speak against the Empire? You dare question your loyalty, General?" Mirren's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "I don't answer to you anymore, Crix. I don't answer to the Empire." The Emperor's eyes narrowed and the room buzzed with tension. Mirren tapped a small device on her wrist, and every screen in the chamber flickered to life, displaying unaltered footage from the Empire's most secret archives. Childhood footage of her, Era Thorn, playing on a derelict colony ship, a happy child before she was taken. Footage of her parents, her real parents, before they were dragged away by Imperial soldiers. A raid, an abduction. The room erupted into chaos as the truth spread across the screens. The lies, the manipulation, the erasure of history, it was all laid bare, and with it, the truth about Era Thorn's true identity. "I am Era Thorn, born on the human colony ship Saluter," she continued, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "I was abducted during the siege of Diraxis, raised as a weapon under your orphan program. You stole my past. You made me forget who I really was." The Emperor's face twisted with rage, his claws trembling as he stepped forward. "This is treason, Mirren. You will be executed for this insolence." Mirren stepped closer, her voice unyielding. "You built your empire on genocide. You stole our children. You made them forget who they were. But we remember now, and we will never forget." With a final, defiant gesture, she turned toward the broadcast screens. The warships outside the capital, once silent, began transmitting her words across the galaxy. Every world, every outpost, every system tuned in to the broadcast. Across the stars, the people of the galaxy heard the truth. For the first time, they saw the face of the Empire's victim, the one they had erased from history, now standing in defiance. As Mirren's words echoed across the galaxy, the Empire began to tremble. Whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire. Governors turned on each other. Fleet captains began questioning their orders. The citizens of the Empire, long controlled by fear, now found themselves faced with a truth they could not deny. Back in the Senate chamber, Crix's fury was palpable, but he was no longer in control. The seeds of doubt had been planted, the Empire's facade was crumbling, and with it, the very foundation of the galaxy's order began to fracture. For a moment the Emperor seemed to hesitate. His gaze flickered between Mirren and the chaos erupting around him. The truth had already begun its work. It was unstoppable. "The people will choose," Mirren said, her voice resolute, "and they will remember." The lights above the Senate flickered as the final transmission of her speech ended. And then, for the first time in centuries, the Empire mighty, unstoppable, knew fear. The truth had shattered their illusions. The galaxy was changing. As the human warships continued to hover in silence above the capital, their message was clear. We never left. Remember, and with that, the empire began to collapse. But the story of humanity's return and the reckoning that followed would live on as a beacon of hope across the stars. The warships that had once been the harbingers of destruction were now the symbols of a new era, one where truth could no longer be suppressed. The galaxy would never be the same again.